I think I wrote this piece. I didn't realize it was already 2 years old. I was writing a piece for my blog about like the question of whether or not we consider a grave that a body is no longer in. Is it still like a sacred space? Do we still think of that as a grave site? Like whether they've been moved or whether it's a space that like we know that they've decomposed enough that they're like not there, but are they still there? So I was sort of like looking at that, and then looking at the site in the Wild Horse Creek area near Cranbrook, and I saw that like their graveyard was there. It's separate from the white settlers' graveyard. I'm sure that's segregation, as well as I read a little bit like that was their choice in a lot of mining towns too, but I'm sure it wasn't completely their choice. And there's divots in the ground that are very clearly what I would think if I was looking at a Western grave site, that would probably be where the coffin had collapsed. I think it becomes an important place when someone's been buried there. If you dug a grave shaft and nothing happened to it and it just filled back in, that would look quite weird if you're doing an excavation, but you could tell that like there's no organic material, there's no bones, etc. You'd be able to tell that that was just a hole that wasn't used. And those do come up sometimes. So we're like, oh, that's an empty grave. So that's not something that like has that connection to the human past. Even if like someone has decomposed away completely, you can usually tell that there was at one point a body there. So my PhD research is looking at 17th century burial landscape development in settler communities on the northeast coast of North America and Newfoundland. So what I'm interested in is sort of like how people in Europe were developing burial grounds and then how that came into community building in the colonies, and like where they put the burial grounds. Was that similar? Did they lay them out in a similar way? Did they change it all up because they were like coming into a place that they considered empty, etc.? And then I'm also looking at how these spaces, like the traditional narrative for especially New England is that it's all white people. But we know that's not true, but that's not what gets written. So I'm really interested in looking at how people who aren't just white dudes were like put into these burial spaces, and there's very few accounts of that so far. I've got like 4 of like a black enslaved man dies, what happens to his body? Sometimes they were buried in the community burial grounds, like where? Was it the same kind of place? What kind of gravestone did they get? Sort of thing. So I wanted to write this piece about the Chinese burials in the Kootenays and in British Columbia in general. So I mostly grew up in British Columbia, and you always hear stories about like the Chinese miners that worked on the railway, but not very much information about them from that period at all, or from the earlier mining period. So I was really interested when I was living in Cranbrook, BC, near this older town from the 1860s, that we knew there were a large population of Chinese miners who were working there. And when I knew that there was a burial ground there as well, but didn't like know anything about it. So it was a good opportunity to sort of look into whether or not their burial ground was still sort of occupied, you could say, whether or not they still had bodies there or if they had all been repatriated, which is what it turned out to be. And sort of what the tradition was in British Columbia with people from China who came over to work, sort of not wanting to be buried here. So they would be interred for a short period of time and then disinterred and have their body sent back to China for a burial with their family. That's like horrifyingly not shocking at all. BC has a really bad history of racism against people from Asia coming over because the continents are, that's the closest thing. A lot of Japanese people during World War II were sent to internment camps in like the forests in BC, which is ridiculous. So hearing that people were like, oh, they want to send their bodies back to China, we'll just dump them in a warehouse on the coast and take the money, like, seemed par for the course for the history of the province, unfortunately. I was doing excavations a couple years ago on a site in Newfoundland with the landowner was wanting to preserve this site, that they were worried that their business was going to impact when they expanded. So the university came and we excavated the burials, and they're being reburied as well, which is awesome. And it was a settler site in a small community. And the soil is so acidic in Newfoundland that these burials from the mid-19th century, they're only like 150 years old, almost completely gone. But you can tell from the soil and from tiny fragments of wood and small pieces of bone that there was a coffin there was a human there. So we know that even though like in the traditional sense, there's not like a corpse laying here, but we know it is still a grave.